They laughed in my face, just like that, shamelessly, while the priest mumbled something about eternal peace and the incense smelled like cheap detergent. I saw them from above, well, not from heaven, let's not exaggerate. I saw them from that open box they'd left half-finished, as if I should be grateful for the varnish. They were laughing. My children, my 3 jewels. Not from sadness, not from nerves, no. They laughed like people who celebrate that a debt is finally paid off. And in a way, yes. For them, my life had been an installment that kept collecting itself. Me, so cautious, so distrustful, had left everything ready. The flowers, the photos, even the coffee. And of course, the voice, my voice, the one they heard when, halfway through the wake, the lights went out all at once. 1 second before hearing me say, as calm as can be, "If you're hearing this, it's because someone helped me die." The silence was immediate. Not even the priest breathed. The middle one crossed herself as if I were the devil. The eldest let out a dry chuckle, that laugh of someone who doesn't know if they're afraid or ashamed, and the youngest, who never could stand blackouts as a child, began to stammer. "This is a joke, right?" "No, son, it wasn't a joke. It was my will, narrated in my own voice, programmed with millimetric precision, because one thing became clear to me before I died. If they wanted to silence me, they'd have to listen to me first. Don't get it twisted. I'm not speaking from the great beyond, nor any corny limbo. I left this recorded with my own throat, with the sound of my lungs making the effort you never made to understand me. Everything that happened, what I prepared, what I discovered, began many months earlier. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before continuing with my story, I'm very curious to know from where in the world and at what time you're joining today. I'd love to read you in the comments, because sometimes one talks to herself for so long that knowing someone is listening on the other side of the silence is almost a miracle. Ready? Good. I'll tell you how it all began, though fair warning. It didn't start with a tragedy, nor a diagnosis, nor a sigh. It started with something as ridiculous as a pill of a different color. One April afternoon, I opened my usual pill organizer, the one with the day's letters rubbed off, and I saw a sky blue capsule where there should have been a white one. I thought the pharmacy had changed the manufacturer, but then I noticed the smell. I don't know if you know that pills have a smell, but the ones that want to put you to sleep forever smell like old plastic. I smelled it, set it on the table, and said, "There's a rat in the rafters." And oh boy, was there. The eldest started visiting me more often that same month. The same one who never had time even for my birthday showed up with grocery bags and lines from a cheap script. "Mom, you can't go on alone. We don't want anything to happen to you." And I looked at him, tea in hand, thinking, sure, what you don't want is for something to happen before I sign. As it happened, that afternoon, instead of taking the capsule, I hid it behind the wall clock. I looked at it every hour, like a sleeping enemy. And then I decided to pretend. Pretend clumsiness, forgetfulness, babbling. Pretend the old age they needed to feel in control. If they wanted me weak, I'd give them weakness but a performance. That was my first trap. And believe me, no one acts better than an old woman tired of pretending patience her whole life. The plan was simple. Observe, listen, and record. And for that, I needed accomplices. I found the best in Noelle, my caregiver, the only one who didn't talk to me in diminutives. I said, "Noelle, if one day I seem dumber than usual, don't correct me. I'm spying." And she, without lifting her eyes from her coffee, answered, "Then I'll set up a recorder and a notebook." That was all. A pact between two women who had seen enough falseness to trust without paperwork. Back to the wake. While my voice kept resounding through the speakers, the 3 of them looked at each other, unable to tell where the audio was coming from. Noelle was there, discreet, hands folded and a half-smile only I could imagine. The eldest searched for the plug, the middle one cried without tears, and the youngest whispered, "Is this part of the service? Oh, my love, if you only knew." The best part of the show hadn't even started. I'd left precise instructions. Every time the lights went out, a new part of my story would be told. Not all truths are said at once. Some need darkness to shine. So brace yourselves, because this isn't the story of a death, but the story of a woman they tried to erase while she was still alive. And if you're going to keep listening to me, I ask one thing. Don't laugh yet. Not yet. The day I opened the pill organizer and saw that sky blue capsule, I understood that the most effective poisons don't come in bottles with skulls, but in wrappers with my name printed and the expiration date up to date. The pill was there, shiny, harmless, like an eye open over the plastic. It wasn't mine, and that tiny detail changed the course of the months I had left. I'd like to say my hands trembled, or that I felt fear, but no, what I felt was a sort of bitter clarity, like when you suddenly get the joke everyone's been telling for years, and, deep down, it's no fun at all. I sat in front of the wall clock, the one with slow hands that sometimes seems to mark old folks' time, and I knew I wasn't wrong. They wanted to do something to me, and I had to get ahead of them before they turned me into their shadow. The first person I called was Noelle. She came in with that silent nurse's step that moves without asking permission, wrinkled uniform, and a frank gaze that never dropped. I showed her the capsule. She looked at it without touching it and said, in her usual tone, dry and warm at the same time, "And what do you think it is? An invitation to eternal rest," I answered. "But I think I'll decline for now." She wasn't surprised. She kept pouring coffee, and when she set it in front of me, simply said, "Do you want us to investigate?" And that's how our pact was born. No big words, no oaths, just that plural, "Let's investigate." It was enough. I knew I could trust her, because Noelle had seen too many times other people's children debating coffins while the mother was still breathing. For days, I watched. I pretended to forget where I left the keys, that signing a receipt was hard, that I confused the neighbors' names. At first it felt awkward, like acting a role that wasn't mine, but soon I discovered that feigned old age gave me a new power, to listen without being seen. No one suspects a distracted old woman. They talk in front of you as if you were a piece of furniture. And that's how I began to gather the first crumbs of truth. One afternoon, while I pretended to doze on the armchair, I heard the eldest talking on the phone in the kitchen. "Yeah, she's more gone now," he said. "In a few days we'll sign everything. The notary's a family friend. Sign everything." 2 words that chilled me. That night I pulled out my old recorder, the cassette one, that relic that still had batteries. Noelle wiped it with a cloth and taught me how to use the phone app to record as well, in case the antique refuses to collaborate. I started recording conversations, silences, noises, the mom, rest, that hid the impatience of someone counting days. In one of those recordings my voice remained, asking the eldest about the medicines. "And this new pill?" I said with practiced innocence. "The doctor changed it," he replied without looking at me. "Oh, really?" "Because the doctor told me she wouldn't change anything until next month." "Well, she must have gotten it wrong." Sure, I smiled. "Doctors get things wrong as often as children do." Noelle held her laughter until he left. Then she looked at me and said, "If you'll allow me, you're dangerous when you play dumb. And you're brave for staying close," I replied. "This is just getting started." Over the next week, I set to checking every drawer, every bag. I found bank papers I didn't remember signing, duplicate statements, and a note in my middle daughter's handwriting. "Find nursing home urgently." I spent a while staring at that phrase, so clean, so proper. Nursing home, it said, as if they were finding me a place to rest. But the word echoing in my head was another: warehouse. A place where they store what's no longer useful, but they don't yet dare to throw away. That's when I thought of Emily, my lawyer. We hadn't seen each other in years, but I remembered her sure voice, the way she bit an unlit cigarette while saying, "People sign out of exhaustion, not trust." I called her on a Tuesday morning. It took her a bit to recognize me, but when she heard my story, her tone changed. "Let me see it," she said. "And don't sign anything, not even a greeting, without me beside you." That very afternoon she came to the house. We sat in the kitchen, with Noelle pretending to wash dishes. I told her everything, The pills, the papers, the calls, the surprise visits. Emily took notes with a firm hand, pressing the pen as if writing on stone. "This is more common than you think," she said. "And dirtier than you can imagine." I nodded. "Clean things get dirty fast when they smell like money," I replied. "We decided to prepare a new will, one they couldn't tamper with. I didn't want it out of revenge. I wanted it for order, for justice, for that absurd need to leave something in its place before disappearing." Emily drafted, revised, sealed, and kept the copies. She explained I could leave special instructions. "You can schedule messages, recordings, whatever you want. It's legal if it's signed and dated," she said. There, in that moment, the idea was born that would later freeze their blood at the wake. Meanwhile, I kept pretending. My children started treating me with that mix of condescension and fake tenderness that's more disgusting than a direct insult. They spoke slowly, touched my shoulder, called me Mommy. Every time they did, I wanted even more to show them my mind was livelier than their remorse. But I held on. We had to wait. One Sunday, the eldest showed up with a bag of food and an envelope. "It's a minor formality, Mom. An authorization so we can help you with the bank." "Authorization," he said, and I could already imagine the fine print. I smiled and asked for time to get my glasses. While I pretended to look for them, I turned on the phone recorder. "Of course, dear, read it aloud so I understand." He read quickly, without lifting his eyes. "I authorize my eldest son to dispose, in case of emergency, of my funds for my care." "How nice," I said, "always looking after me." I signed, but not on the right line. I signed in the corner, diagonally, with last year's date. An invalid document, but enough for him to think he'd won. When he left, I called Emily. "They've started," I said. "Then speed up the plan," she replied. Noelle helped me hide the recordings. We bought a metal biscuit tin and put it in the freezer, under the bag of hake. "Cold preserves everything," she said, laughing. And she was right. There slept the first audios, copies of papers, and the sky blue capsule wrapped in foil. Each piece of evidence slept peacefully, waiting to wake up. Meanwhile, I went on playing the scatterbrained old woman. I left the kettle on, pretended to forget the neighbors' names. One of them, the lady on the 5th floor, told me one day in the elevator, "Oh, ma'am, I notice you're different, softer." I smiled. If she only knew. The weeks went by like that, between small traps and long afternoons of waiting. There was something hypnotic in the routine of my pretending. I became a spectator in my own home, listening to how my children organized themselves to dismantle my life with admirable efficiency. Sometimes I thought that if they'd used that intelligence to love, another ending would have been possible. But love doesn't pay interest, and money does. That night, before sleeping, I wrote a line in my notebook. "The years won't kill me. Misplaced trust will." I closed the notebook, turned off the light, and, for the first time in a long while, smiled with relief. Not because I was safe, but because I'd recovered something I thought I'd lost. Control of my story, and that, at my age, is worth more than any inheritance. The sky blue pill was still behind the clock, waiting for me. But I was no longer afraid of it. It was just one more proof that, although they thought otherwise, I was still awake. The day they came with the notary, I understood, without a shadow of doubt, that the war had officially begun. The funny thing is, they chose the moment with a surgeon's precision. A Thursday at noon, when the sun falls right through the kitchen window and the light turns so white you can't tell whether what you see is truth or reflection. They arrived with beef empanadas, a bottle of cheap wine, and that tense smile the three of them practice when they want to look united. "Mom, let's have lunch together, it's been so long," they said. And I, with my best absent-minded face, answered, "Empanadas? Odd on a weekday. You're cooking something and it's not minced meat." They all laughed, even the notary, a man with a thin mustache who looked more like an insurance salesman than a representative of the law. Noelle moved through the kitchen with studied leisure, serving glasses, of water and observing every gesture like someone gauging the temperature of a pot about to boil. I knew she'd left the hidden recorder on in the sideboard. Emily, my lawyer, had briefed me for this moment. Don't argue, don't deny, don't sign anything. Just listen and let them sink in their own enthusiasm. The notary cleared his throat and pulled out a file of papers. He said my full name with solemnity and explained it was a patrimonial protection document. A simple formality, the eldest clarified, so you don't have to worry about payments, accounts, procedures. We'll handle everything. I smiled with that feigned sweetness I learned at school parent meetings, when you already know the lie is making the rounds, but you keep quiet to avoid a scene. Of course, dear, I said, though I don't quite understand what you're protecting me from. From any abuse, he answered without blinking. Ah, from you? What a relief. Noelle almost choked on the water. The notary coughed and explained it was a voluntary guardianship, a legal device so my children could act in my name in case of cognitive deterioration. You know, Mom, in case one day you're not in condition to decide, added the middle one, with the voice of a commercial's nurse. Oh, sure, I replied, in case one day I start thinking clearly, wouldn't want me making the mistake of staying alive. They didn't get the sarcasm or pretended not to and kept up the theater. While the notary read endless paragraphs, I remembered Emily's words. Sign anything, but with my signature on top. We'd prepared a mirror document, a notarial revocation dated before theirs, sealed and stored in her office. Everything I signed that day would be wet paper. I took the pen, looked at the paper with a wavering expression, pretended my hand shook. Where does the signature go? I asked. Here, Mom, right here, said the youngest, pointing to the broth. Space. I signed very slowly, while sweat purled on his forehead. When I finished, the notary smiled, satisfied, and gathered the papers. Done? Everything in order, he said. In that instant, I felt like an actress in a play so absurd it could only be held up by the hypocrisy of its audience. When they left, the house's silence was almost physical. Noelle shut the door, looked at me, and let out a restrained laugh. And now? She asked. Now we wait for Emily to show them the real script, I answered. That same afternoon, the lawyer called to tell me she'd had a visitor. The notary, furious, demanding the validity of my signature. I showed him the prior revocation, the one we did last week, Emily said. The color drained from his face. They won't try again so soon. I laughed with a mix of relief and sadness. I always thought betrayal hurt more when wrapped in affection, but I discovered what hurts most is realizing you're no longer surprised. The following days were tense calm. My children didn't come back, and rumors started circulating in the neighborhood. A neighbor told me she'd greeted the eldest at the bakery, and he looked exhausted. Another looked at me with pity, as if I were terminally ill. They'd begun their campaign, the senile mother, confused, influenced by an interested lawyer and caregiver. And though they angered me, I admit I felt a secret sort of triumph. When they defame you, it's because they fear what you know. One afternoon, I decided to go over my things more carefully. I opened the drawer where I kept the light, gas, and phone bills, and found a paper I didn't recall, an appraisal of my house, signed by a technician I didn't know. The price was ridiculous, almost half its real value. At the bottom, a handwritten note. Possible dampness on north wall. There was no dampness at all, but there was a signature, the appraiser's, and a copy for the Ramirez family. That's how I discovered they planned to sell the house before even declaring me incompetent. I laughed to myself, a laugh without joy but with some pride. They were going to need more than an appraiser and a notary to throw me out of my own walls. That night I told Noelle what I'd found. She, with her practical way of grasping life, suggested recording a conversation with the appraiser if he returned. I don't think he'll come back, I said. But the next day, as if fate enjoyed twisted plots, he showed up at the door, folder in hand, and a sour look. He said he was there to verify a detail. I invited him in, sat him in front of the north wall, and served tea. While he pretended to inspect, I asked, "Do you usually work with my children?" "With the young man?" Yes, he's a good client. He asked for discretion. Discretion about what? I said, smiling. You know, these family things, sales, urgencies, every word was recorded. From the kitchen, Noelle watched to make sure the phone kept recording. When the man left, I saved the file in the recipes folder, a name no one would think to check. That night, I called Emily again. We have more evidence, I said. They didn't just want my money, they wanted my house before I even knew. She answered calmly. Then, ma'am, we'll have to prepare the stage for the final act. I hung up and stared at the window. Outside, the lights of the building across flickered like someone was playing with the switch. I thought about that, about the idea of the blackout, about the possibility that my voice would hang in the air when I was no longer here. That's when I started to imagine the end. The hall, the people, the lights going out, the silence, my voice returning to tell it all. Not for revenge, but out of the need to let the truth float. That night I wrote a note in my notebook. The living lie because they can, the dead because they learn to record. I turned off the lamp and, for the first time felt, the fear had changed sides. The silence after that meeting with the appraiser didn't last long. When money becomes a common language, traders always find new words. One ordinary morning, while I was trying to keep my coffee from getting cold before the first sip, I heard Noelle's steps coming down the stairs, phone in hand and her brow furrowed. They're coming again, she said without raising her voice. I didn't ask who because I already knew. I put on my robe, sat by the window, and waited. With that mix of weariness and patience you only learn after more than 70 years watching your children believe they know more than life itself. They arrived unannounced, as always. The eldest with his fake salesman's smile, the middle one with a perfume so strong it seemed to want to cover guilt, and the youngest, that poor man who still pretended to be innocent but had already sold even his tenderness in installments. They brought a new man, another stranger, in a tie with papers. This time he wasn't a notary, he was a different appraiser, younger, more self-assured. He said he'd come to verify the realistic value of the house. I looked him up and down and knew realistic meant discounted for convenience. I invited them in, offered water, but none accepted. Everything about them was haste, urgency, badly hidden nerves. Noelle watched from the kitchen door, not intervening, but with that look of someone who's seen too many movies and knows exactly when the twist comes. The new appraiser began walking down the hallway, tapping the walls with his knuckles as if looking for the hollow sound of a lie. He stopped at the dining room corner and murmured something about dampness. The middle one nodded quickly, almost with relief, as if dampness justified the looting. I interrupted him calmly. Do you see damp, young man? Not yet, but it's likely, he said, without looking at me. Then please also note that it's likely I'll win the lottery tonight. The man blushed, my children pretended not to hear, and Noelle pivoted on her heels to hide her laugh. I kept talking, like someone giving a lesson in dignity to a room full of the deaf. Look, this house has clean walls because it was cleaned with work, not paint. If you're going to lower the price, do it for your conscience, not for dampness. He didn't answer. He took photos, signed some papers, and left, leaving behind a dense air loaded with that mix of cheap perfume and dishonor that hangs when someone lies in the name of duty. As soon as the door closed, Noelle went to the freezer, took out the biscuit tin where we kept the evidence, and showed me the tiny camera she'd hidden in the hallway vase. It had all been recorded, their voices, their gestures, their hurry. Another piece of the puzzle I was putting together before dying. That afternoon, while the sun filtered through the curtain, I sat alone in the living room and thought about what it feels like when your own home becomes a battlefield. There's no sadder noise than walls hearing your children argue over their price. I thought of my late husband, how much he hated other people's money, and imagined what he would have said about all this. He'd probably have kept quiet, as always, but not me. I was no longer of an age to keep quiet, nor had the desire, nor the fear. That very night, I asked Noelle to help me pack the evidence. We stored it carefully in the metal tin and sealed it with tape. She asked where I wanted to hide it. I pointed to the freezer, under the bag of hake. Cold preserves the truth, I told her, and she replied, it also makes it last. She was right. Over the following weeks, my children kept their distance. I assumed they were working on the next move, because that family of mine always behaved like a company. If one strategy failed, another was designed immediately. I used the reprieve to review my papers, my memories, even my old photos. I realized I'd spent my life organizing things others always disorganized, and suddenly a new calm washed over me, as if I finally understood the best defense isn't revenge, but patience. One day, Emily called to tell me the previous notary had tried to register the document I signed, but the system rejected it for date anomaly. The revocation she'd filed first was perfectly valid, and my children's attempt now stood as an irregular act. They're cornered, she said, but they don't know it yet. Don't get ahead. Let them grow confident. Her voice sounded serene, but I detected a spark of professional excitement that made me smile. Sometimes justice needs discreet accomplices. That night I slept better than in months. I woke early, with the first birdsong, and sat in front of the mirror. I looked at myself with a new curiosity. There was a spark in my eyes I hadn't seen in years, a kind of secret joy that didn't come from winning, but from staying alive while they counted on the opposite. I ran my hand through my hair, breathed deeply, and thought, the final blow is still missing. That morning, without telling Noel, I walked to the neighborhood bank. The manager, a kind man I'd spoken with for decades, greeted me with that forced smile employees use when they fear a complaint. He offered a seat and coffee, and before I could open my mouth, he said, "Your son was here yesterday." "Oh, really?" I answered with icy calm. "How attentive. And what did he want?" "He said he needed to move a large sum to pay for your nursing home." Nursing home. Again, that word that smells like abandonment, disguised as affection. I asked him to print all recent movements and showed him my ID. "Anything without my signature or my voice is a crime," I warned. He nodded, uncomfortable, and handed me the papers. There were transfer attempts, access requests, logged calls. I didn't need more evidence. On the way home, I walked slowly, enjoying the breeze like someone saying goodbye to something without saying it out loud. Noelle was waiting at the door. I showed her the documents and told her about the bank. She leaned on the frame, crossed her arms, and said, "They're desperate." "Yes," I replied, "and desperate people make mistakes." At lunch, while the stew's aroma filled the kitchen, we thought about how to keep all that information safe so they couldn't erase it. Noelle proposed scanning everything and emailing it to Emily. We did it that same afternoon. Each file was tagged with a date and a keyword. The last one was called patience. When we finished, I sat by the window and watched the gray sky that hinted rain. A childhood memory came to me, my mother saying storms clean the air. I thought maybe I was making my own, a small storm, but enough to clean names and guilt. That night, while the wind rattled the shutters, I went to the freezer, opened the lid, and looked at the metal tin under the hake. I ran my fingers over it like an amulet. I felt accompanied, protected, almost powerful. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of death. I was afraid of not being on time for my voice to tell it. I closed the freezer, turned off the light, and went to sleep with a smile so serene it would scare anyone who didn't know that sometimes the sweetest revenge is the one prepared in silence and served cold. The day at the bank etched itself in my mind with the precision of a wartime date, the kind you don't forget because they change the way your feet touch the ground. From then on, everything that had been a suspicion became certainty, and with certainty came a strange calm even Noelle noticed. "You've got a different face," she told me one morning while watering the plants, and I told her that when you stop doubting, fear becomes useless. She laughed, handed me the watering can, and added, "Then you're ready for the final battle." I didn't answer, but I knew she was right. The time had come to set the last moves before they made the next one, because when the ambitious feel cornered, they don't retreat, they push. The first push came on a rainy afternoon, when the doorbell rang with that insistence that always announces bad news. Noel opened it, and there was the youngest, soaked shirt stuck to his body and the eyes of someone who hasn't slept. He came in without greeting, left the umbrella dripping on the floor, and started talking without looking at me. He said there were debts, that banks don't forgive, that the house could serve as collateral, and that he did it all for my own good. I listened with a patience that surprised me, because just a few months earlier I would have exploded in shouts, but now I saw him with a mix of tenderness and disappointment. He wasn't the son who kept me up at night. He was the man who never learned to be an adult without asking permission. When he finished his speech, I offered a towel, asked him to sit, and said, "If you really want to help me, don't touch my money. Help me keep my name clean, that can't be bought with bills." He lowered his head, muttered something and left, leaving the damp smell of desperation floating in the air. The next day, the landline rang. It was the bank manager, voice a little shaky, like someone apologizing before speaking. He told me he'd received an order to transfer a large sum, signed with my name but written in a man's hand. "I'm calling to confirm," he said, and my silence was answer enough. I asked him to print everything, every attempt, every time, and prepare the documents for me to pick up in person. "Are you sure?" he asked. "More than ever," I replied. When I went to the bank, Noelle insisted on coming, and although I preferred to go alone, I let her. We walked under the leaden sky, dodging puddles, the wind kicking up October's dry leaves. We went in. I greeted the guard like nothing, and sat before the manager's desk. He had the papers ready. 3 transfer attempts, all the same day, same amount. I read each line slowly, like someone chewing an offense. When I finished, I asked for a pen and signed at the bottom of the last document, next to a note that read, "I do not authorize, and I demand an investigation for forged signature." The man looked at me wide-eyed, as if he didn't expect such clarity from an old lady, and I smiled. "You see, I still recognize my handwriting. What my children forget is that I also recognize theirs." On the way home, the air smelled of storm, and I felt something in me had changed. It wasn't anger nor sadness. It was a kind of bitter relief, like when a wound finally bleeds enough to clean itself. I knew that desperate move would expose them, and that soon they'd try something else, clumsier and more urgent. Noelle sensed it too. That night, while we stored the papers with the recordings, she told me she was starting to feel afraid. "Not for you," she clarified, "for what they might do when they see nothing works." I looked at her and knew she was right, but the wheel could no longer be stopped. What had started wouldn't end with pleading, nor with tears, nor with love. Fear arrived a few days later, disguised as an accident. I got up early, went to the bathroom, and felt the floor shift beneath my feet. A second later, I was on the tiles, cheek against the cold, the metallic taste of blood in my mouth, and a pain climbing from hip to chest. I don't remember if I screamed, but I do remember Noelle's voice, her firm hands, the call to emergency, the ambulance, the sirens. At the hospital they said there was no fracture, just a mild contusion and a big scare. When I returned home, I found it too clean, as if someone had spent the day erasing traces. Noelle confirmed it. All 3 had come, each with a different excuse, and stayed a while in my room. She pretended not to see them, but noticed something had changed in the pill organizer. That night, when everyone slept, I turned on the bedside lamp and checked. Pills were missing. Not many, just a couple, but enough to throw off the count. I took the rest out, set them on the table, and compared them with photos I'd taken weeks earlier. There was an almost imperceptible difference, the tone of the coating, the smell. Noelle noticed it too. "They're not the same," she said. My hand trembled a little, but not from fear, from indignation. "Don't worry, my children," I murmured. "If you want to put me to sleep, you're going to have to swallow the evidence yourselves." I put them all in a glass jar, with a handwritten label, "Family Keepsake." That was my way of not forgetting. The next morning, I called Emily. I told her about the accident, the bank moves, the pills. She listened in silence, only interrupting to say, "Keep everything and don't change your routine. If they touch you again, I'll call the prosecutor's office." She promised to stop by in the afternoon with new documents. I nodded, and for the first time in a long time, I wanted the threat to come true. When she arrived, she carried a thick folder in her bag. She explained she had formalized a preventive complaint for attempted manipulation of assets, a legal technicality that sounded as cold as it was fair. Then she asked me to sign one more power, the definitive one authorizing her to execute my posthumous will with detailed instructions for the funeral. I looked her in the eyes and said, "I want them to hear me to the end, even when I'm no longer here. Let no one be able to shut me off early." She nodded, took notes, and told me about timers, recordings, and legality. Everything was possible if it was recorded. That's how the plan I would finish myself began to take shape. That night, Noelle helped me put everything in its place. Documents in the cold box, recordings in the cloud, a copy at Emily's office. Before bed, we sat quietly a while, looking at the lamp. "What if they don't believe you?" she asked. "Then let them live with the doubt," I replied. Sometimes the greatest punishment is not knowing how far the truth goes. When I turned off the light, my body hurt, but my mind felt clean, as if hitting the floor had shed the last weight I carried. Outside, the wind battered the windows, and I thought perhaps the storm was already upon us. I fell asleep with a slight smile, knowing my enemies were my children, but that this time, at last, I was the one writing the story. The days after the fall had a strange rhythm, as if time had decided to walk sideways. My body hurt, but what hurt more was the certainty that the fall hadn't been entirely an accident. Something in the house's air had changed. The silence wasn't the usual one anymore. It was a tense, watchful silence, the kind you hear with your skin more than your ears. Noelle noticed it too. She moved more cautiously, locked the door even when we were inside, and each night left a small light on in the hallway, as if that tiny glow could ward off what we still couldn't name. Emily had left precise instructions. I mustn't alter my routine, mustn't show suspicion, mustn't speak more than necessary with my children. "Let them believe the blow made you docile," she told me before leaving that afternoon, and her tone was so firm it almost sounded like a medical order. I did just that. For days I practiced the calm of someone feigning forgetfulness, but every gesture of mine had a purpose: observe, record, anticipate. If they were planning another move, I had to be a step ahead. The youngest returned first, with flowers and a face of regret. He brought a huge bouquet, the kind bought more to decorate guilt than to show affection. He sat in front of me, fidgeting hands at a loss for words. He spoke about the fall, about how it had made him think, about how maybe we'd grown too distant. I listened without interrupting, letting him empty himself, and when he finished, I offered tea. As he drank, I watched the slight tremor in his fingers, the evasive gaze, the short breath. "You've got something to tell me," I dropped suddenly, and his cup wobbled. "Nothing, Mom," he muttered, but his voice had no conviction. I let him leave without more, knowing that if remorse is real, it always ends up speaking on its own. Then came the middle one, with her expensive perfume and flight attendant smile. She wanted to organize my medication as a precaution, she said, and offered to stay the night. Noelle, with her steel courtesy, thanked her for the kindness, but assured her she had everything under control. My daughter insisted a bit, and in the end left offended, saying the old woman mistrusted everyone. She wasn't wrong. What she didn't know was that every word of hers had been recorded, and that such sweet insistence would form part of the file that one day would make the whole family tremble. The eldest was the last to show. Always calculating, always impeccable, he arrived in his dark suit and boss's voice. "I just came to see how you are," he said, but his eyes scanned the house like taking inventory. He talked to me about nursing homes, special care, doctors he knew. I let him talk. When he finished his presentation, I leaned forward a little and asked, "And what if I refuse?" He didn't answer right away. He inhaled, smiled, and said, "Nothing, Mom. I just want to help." "Then help me live in peace," I replied, "and when I die, you'll have time to manage my ruins." The phrase lodged in his head. I saw it in his furrowed brow as he left. He knew my calm wasn't surrender, and that unsettled him. That night, during dinner, Noelle took the metal tin from the freezer and set it on the table. "We have to reinforce this," she said. We lifted the lid and reviewed every document, every recording, every photograph. The evidence grew like a living archive, and I was surprised by her meticulousness, numbering envelopes, labeling with dates. "If one ever goes missing, we'll know who came in," she said, and the seriousness in her voice sent a chill through me. We decided to add the new items: the attempted bank transfer, the visit of the three, the conversation with the appraiser. Every piece had its place. When we finished, we wrapped the tin in a plastic bag and hid it again under the hake. Noelle covered it with a layer of crushed ice and, while she did, said without lifting her eyes, "This is no longer a defense, ma'am, it's a testament." I didn't answer, because I knew she was right. The next day, I woke early and sat down to write the letters Emily had suggested. One to the doctor, another to the bank, one more to an old friend who worked at the local press. In each, I recounted the essential, with dates and names, and added a line that was hard to write. "If one day a recording of me appears speaking after I'm dead, believe it. It's me." My hands trembled as I signed, not from weakness, but because I understood I was leaving a record of my end before it arrived. In the afternoon, Emily came to collect them. She also brought the plans for the timed lighting system we'd agreed on. "It will work," she assured me. "No one will be able to say it was a trick." She explained how to program the blackouts, how to tie the audio to the funeral parlor's speakers, how to leave instructions for Noelle to activate everything without arousing suspicion. As she spoke, I thought how absurd it was to prepare your own funeral with the precision of someone organizing a dinner. But there was something liberating in it. If they'd wanted to turn me into a useless old woman, I was going to become my own stage director. We spent hours testing the equipment. Noelle wrote down the steps, Emily checked the cables, and I listened to my recorded voice repeating the opening lines of what would be my final message. At first I was embarrassed to hear myself. I sounded harsher than I remembered, but then I understood that harshness was my strength. It was the voice of a woman who had stopped asking permission to exist. That night, after Emily left, Noelle and I fell into a long silence. Outside, it rained. The sound of water on the windows seemed like slow applause. I poured myself tea, settled into the armchair and said, "Everything's ready, but I don't like thinking the ending depends on a recorder." Noelle, without looking at me, replied, "It doesn't depend on that. It depends on you. The recorder will only do what you already did. Tell the truth." I kept thinking about that while the steam rose slowly from the tea. The truth. That word my children used as an excuse, my husband used as a shield, that everyone manipulated to sleep at night. I wasn't going to sleep. I was going to speak. And if I had to do it after death, then so be it. That dawn, a noise woke me. A sharp, metallic thud. I got up slowly, walked down the hallway, with my heart pounding in my chest. In the kitchen, no one, but the window was ajar. I slid the latch, went back to bed, and couldn't sleep. At daybreak, I told Noelle. We checked the house. Nothing missing, nothing disturbed, except for one detail. On the sideboard where I kept family photos, one of them, the one from my 70th birthday, was face down. A minimal gesture, almost invisible, but it rattled me. I didn't know if it had been the wind, a hand, or a warning, but I understood the game was reaching its last act. I sat to write another note in my notebook. If they want to erase me, they'll have to listen to me first. Then I hid it in the same place where I had once tucked the sky blue pill. I don't know why, but I felt those two objects were alike. Small proofs that I was still alive, that I still had the last word. That morning, when the sun timidly came through the window and the smell of coffee filled the house, I knew I'd crossed the line. It was no longer about protecting what was mine, but about leaving the story in order so no one else could lie for me. And while Noelle set the table and whistled softly, I told myself in a low voice, "The worst has passed. What comes next is the end, and the end will be mine." Sometimes, when the house was completely silent and only the faint hum of the refrigerator could be heard, I found myself imagining how my voice would sound when I was gone. Not on the recordings, I'd listened to those 1,000 times, but in the minds of those who stayed, echoing among the furniture, slipping through cracks, repeating the phrases that annoyed them so much in life. That idea made me smile. If I hadn't gotten them to listen while alive, perhaps death would turn me, at last, into a presence impossible to ignore. The day of the dress rehearsal was one of those days that seem foreign to their own purpose. The sun shone mercilessly, the air smelled like dry earth, and the whole city seemed in a good mood, as if nothing bad could happen. I, on the other hand, got up with the feeling everything was about to align. Noelle made me a hearty breakfast, insisting I needed energy. "Today we test the blackout," she said, like we were talking about a theater performance. In a way, it was. Emily arrived shortly after noon, with her black briefcase and that air of a woman who never gets ruffled, even if the world collapses. She brought the building's electrician, a young, discreet man already in on my plan. We'd agreed to pass him off as maintenance to avoid suspicion. He moved with the precision of someone who knows electricity has its own rhythm, that you have to respect it the way you respect the dead. While he checked the system connections, I watched every move, wondering if all this wasn't too crazy. But each time doubt crept in, I remembered the pills, the fake signatures, the house appraised for scraps, and doubt vanished. The test was simple. The parlor's lights should go out at an exact time, and when they did, the first recording would automatically play. Emily wanted to be sure the system wouldn't fail, and that the sound would be clear from any corner. The electrician checked the panel, tested switches, adjusted a timer. When all was ready, he asked me to wait. The clock struck 5 on the dot, and at 5:10 the blackout was to happen. The three of us sat, in silence, waiting. During those 10 minutes, time stretched. I thought how absurd it was to rehearse my own funeral, but also how necessary. Somehow, that preparation was the most lucid way to accept the end was near. I no longer feared it. I only wanted it to be fair, for my exit to carry the weight my presence had lost with them. At 5 to 10 sharp, the lights flickered and went out. A second later, my voice came from the speaker, low and steady, firmer than I remembered. "If you're hearing this, it's because someone helped me die." The sound filled the room like a tide, and for a few moments, no one breathed. Emily nodded silently, moved, and the electrician smiled with respect. I stayed still, listening to my own voice, recognizing in every word a mix of irony and sadness that felt new, almost foreign. It was a voice that didn't beg for compassion, only attention. When the test ended, the lights came back, and for the first time in a long time, everything made sense. Emily congratulated me, said the system was perfect, and the recording sounded even better than expected. Noelle, who'd been in the kitchen feigning indifference, approached with shining eyes. "It came out beautiful, ma'am. It almost scares me," she said, and her sincerity made me laugh. I patted her hand, and in that simple gesture was everything that bound us, the complicity of two women who knew too much about ingratitude. That afternoon, when the technician left, and Emily filed the documents in her briefcase, the two of us remained alone. I struggled a bit to exhale, as if my body still didn't dare relax. Noelle put on soft music, an old song my husband used to hum, and I let the melody carry me. I thought about how sound has memory, how notes can hang in the walls long after we've gone. Later, as the sun set and orange light filtered through the curtains, I sat down to write. Not a letter, not a complaint, but something different. A text with no addressee, a sort of confession that perhaps no one would ever read. I wrote about loneliness, about anger, about how easy it is to become invisible when you age, and how ironic it is to have to die to regain attention. I filled 3 pages without stopping. In the end, I added a line that came all at once. Dying isn't so serious. What's serious is being erased while you're still breathing. I put the paper in an unmarked envelope and placed it in the metal tin, with everything else. Then I went to the balcony. The air was fresh, and for a moment I thought I heard voices in the street, distant laughter, a child calling his mother. I stayed there a long time, watching the sky darken, and felt something strange, as if the world kept going without me, and I was already practicing the distance that would soon separate me from it all. We ate little that night. Noelle was quiet, more than usual. When we finished, she looked at me with a new seriousness and said, "If one day I don't get here in time, remember the code." I nodded, though there was no way to forget it. We'd practiced it so often I could repeat it in my sleep. The code opened the small safe in the bedroom where I kept the envelope with the final instructions, the will, and a message recorded just for her. Noelle was my guarantee, my witness and, in a way, my moral heir. Before bed, I listened again to one of the recordings. I wanted to make sure the voice sounded natural, not melodramatic. Playback began, and I heard my laugh at the beginning, a brief, dry laugh, and then that phrase I always liked to repeat. "I didn't come to scare you, I came to put names on things." I shivered. It was exactly what I needed to say. I lay down, but couldn't sleep right away. I closed my eyes and ran through everything. The pills, the visits, the house, the bank, the fall, the rehearsal. Each memory linked to the next, as if my life had always been preparing for this outcome. I thought of my children, and wondered whether, deep down, they had ever understood anything about me. Maybe not, and maybe it no longer mattered. Justice doesn't always arrive to teach, sometimes it just comes to balance the weight of things. Sleep took me at dawn, just as light began to seep through the window. I dreamed I walked down a long hallway full of family portraits, but in each frame the faces were blurred. Only one was sharp, mine, laughing. When I woke up, I could still hear, somewhere in memory, the echo of my own voice saying, "Now then, let the show begin." The dawn of the day I died was so ordinary it's almost funny to think of it. No omen, no shiver, none of that solemnity films insist on gifting the dying. I got up early, made coffee like always, and watched the steam rising from the cup, floating a few seconds before vanishing. Sometimes I think life is like that, like steam that dissipates before you manage to name it. Noelle arrived soon after, hair tied back and eyes puffy from little sleep. "I dreamed of you," she said, offering me toast. "That's not good luck," I replied with a smile. But deep down, I knew something in me was saying goodbye, even if I didn't quite know it yet. I spent the morning writing small notes, details I'd forgotten to include in the letters, household instructions, names of neighbors who should get the plants, recipes I didn't want lost. Trivial things, but they made me feel alive, useful, needed. As I wrote, sunlight filtered through the window and fell on my trembling hands, and I thought perhaps that's what dying is. Watching yourself slowly blur in the day's brightness. The tiredness began at noon. Not pain, but a sweet exhaustion, as if the body said, "We've come far enough." Noelle wanted to call the doctor, but I stopped her. I asked her to let me take a nap, and, if I didn't wake, to follow the plan. She cried in silence, and that image stuck with me, because I'd never seen such a strong woman break with such delicacy. "Don't cry, Noelle," I told her. "You know I'm not leaving out of fear, I'm leaving in peace. There are people who need to hear my voice more than see me breathing." And she nodded, drying her tears with the back of her hand, saying nothing more. I remember lying down with the window ajar, letting in the fresh air. On the nightstand was the same old clock, ticking slowly, steadily, and that repetition lulled me. I fell asleep thinking of my children, how they'd look hearing my voice one last time, and I wasn't afraid, only a kind of serene curiosity. Then nothing. The rest they told me later, or rather I reconstructed it in my head with the precision of someone who knows the script by heart. They say Noelle found me, that she called the ambulance and then Emily, and followed my instructions to the letter, that it all was quick, drama-free, that the body simply went out like a lamp that had finished its shift. The funeral home did their part, the lawyer coordinated details, and my children showed up more out of obligation than sorrow. I picture it clearly, the hall filled with lilies and that thick disinfectant smell, metal chairs, the murmur of conversations that start low and end in venomous whispers. I know the eldest arrived first, in his black suit, wearing the look of a responsible man. He greeted everyone with the composure of someone who pretends to know how to handle pain, but in his eyes there was relief. The middle one came, after, with dark glasses, too much makeup, and a new coat, not out of respect, but to make sure they noticed she could still afford luxuries. The youngest, on the other hand, showed up late, disheveled, smelling of cheap alcohol, and with a clumsy sadness that almost tendered me. Almost. Noelle told me everything was normal until Emily gave the signal. At the exact hour, the hall lights flickered once, twice, and went out. There was a murmur of confusion, a couple of nervous laughs, and then my voice cut through the dark. If you're hearing this, it's because someone helped me die. Silence fell immediately, the kind that weighs in the air. I can imagine their faces, the eldest rigid, the middle one's hand to her chest, the youngest looking around as if the ceiling might collapse on him. The recording continued. I told about the pills, the bank, the house. I named dates, documents, recordings. Each word of mine was a needle piercing the mask of hypocrisy they'd woven. They say the middle one cried without tears, the youngest sagged into a chair, and the eldest, for a moment, tried to disconnect everything, but Emily stopped him. If you touch a single cable, she said, you lose the right to hear the rest of the will. He stayed still, chewing his rage. The audio also played fragments of recordings I'd made, their voices, the phrases they denied having said, the bank's ring, the sound of the metal tin opening. There was no room for doubt. The truth, that word they loved to mouth, now stood before all, naked and blunt. Some attendees, neighbors, distant relatives, began to murmur among themselves. Others stood up, uncomfortable. No one dared leave. Emily took care of that. She warned whoever left would lose their share of the will, not out of vengeance, but because that's how I'd stipulated it, and no one could alter my last will. When the audio ended, the lights came back, and the silence was almost as thick as the prior darkness. They say. The first to speak was the youngest, babbling it was all a misunderstanding, that I must have been confused, that someone manipulated me. But Emily's voice cut him short. Everything is documented. Then the eldest tried to take control, as always, saying this was cruelty, that I wouldn't have wanted this, that someone had used my voice for macabre ends. And just then, the second part of the recording began, the one I'd prepared for that kind of speech. Don't make that face, children. This isn't cruelty, it's memory. Mine, the one you tried to erase. That phrase was enough to make the hall collapse. There were arguments, shouts, a glass falling to the floor. Noelle, firm, stayed put, not moving a muscle. When the chaos calmed, Emily announced there would be a brief recess before continuing with the final reading of the will. During that break, a couple of strangers entered the hall. Noelle recognized them at once, agents from the Financial Crimes Unit. No one had called them that night. The complaint had been filed weeks earlier, with enough evidence to open a case. I can imagine the eldest's face at seeing them, the sudden stiffness in his shoulders, the way the middle one stepped aside as if to disavow. The youngest cried, asking to be heard. But there was nothing left to hear because everything had been said. Noelle told me later that while the agent spoke with Emily and took down names, some of the attendees approached my casket. I don't know what they felt, guilt or simple curiosity. I like to think that for a second, the silence forced them to look inward, and that maybe, just maybe, they recognized themselves in their own pettiness. When the break ended, and the lawyer announced the continuation, no one moved. The lights went out again, and this time my voice sounded softer, almost tired. Don't be afraid. I haven't come back for revenge. I came to finish what I started. And then, the second audio began, the longest, the most precise, the one where I explained what still needed saying, what completed my justice. They say in that moment the hall lost its air, that everyone held their breath, that even those who didn't know me felt something deeper than an inheritance being resolved right there. And although I wasn't there to see it, I know it was so, because sometimes justice doesn't need living witnesses, just a voice that refuses to be buried. They say the second audio began with my laugh. A short, dry laugh, like a slap. Then my voice grew lower, slower, with the pause of someone who knows each word will land like a stone on another's conscience. "I didn't come to make you suffer," I said. "I came to remind you how pain is built." And then I told what they had refused to hear in life. The whole story, without ornaments, without euphemisms. I began with the day I discovered the altered pills, how they told me they were new vitamins, how I hid them behind the clock and feigned forgetfulness to catch them. I described each detail: the plastic smell, the different color, the feeling of swallowing distrust every morning. I left nothing out, not even the moment when I heard their voices plotting guardianship in the kitchen, thinking I was asleep. "Lies," I said in the audio, "don't need poison. They swallow themselves." The whole hall fell mute. Some lowered their eyes, others, like the eldest, held their gaze with a mix of anger and fear. The middle one pressed the handkerchief to her mouth, trying to quell a tremble that wasn't crying. The youngest, eyes swollen, muttered unintelligible things, asking forgiveness without quite knowing why. My voice continued, relentless, as if it had finally found its natural rhythm. I told about the bank, the money movements, the recorded calls, the forged handwriting, the attempts to convince the manager I was no longer fit to decide. I repeated dates, names, amounts. The sound of paper being signed echoed in the poor recording. It was the final proof. "You thought my silence was forgetfulness," I said. "But forgetfulness is a luxury only the guilty can afford." Then, according to Noel, some guests began shifting in their seats, like they wanted to leave and couldn't. Emily, with her firm voice, asked them to wait. "It's not over," she said, and she was right. The hardest part came after, when I spoke of the years I spent holding that family up with a love they never knew to appreciate. I wasn't a perfect mother, I confessed, but neither was I a woman you should have been ashamed of. You learned to count money before memories. And when the money ran out, you counted me as an expense. The middle one's tears were real for the first time, or so they say. The youngest tried to stand, but Emily stopped him with a look that brooked no argument. The eldest remained frozen, jaw clenched, knuckles white, staring ahead as if facing an invisible jury. And then came the part no one expected. My voice, suddenly gentler, said, "I don't want empty inheritances. I want you to give it all back. The jewels, the money, the respect you broke. But above all, give back among yourselves what you lost: shame." That line fell like a clean blow. Emily opened a folder and began reading the clause I had added to the will. The house would belong to none of them, but to Noel. For having cared for me without price, for having seen a person in me when everyone else counted me as a burden. The murmur was immediate. Some applauded silently, others held their heads. The eldest stood, furious, shouting it was manipulation. That woman had tricked us, that I must have been under influence. Emily replied with the calm of someone holding all the winning cards. "Everything was recorded and validated in the presence of witnesses, sir. Your mother knew exactly what she was doing." The middle one collapsed into a chair. The youngest, trembling, apologized to Noel, who merely nodded without a word. She was never one for grand gestures, and that silence of hers was more dignified than any speech. The eldest kept talking, threatening lawyers, lawsuits, challenges. But no one listened anymore. Deep down, everyone knew the battle had ended before it began. My voice closed the recording with a final reflection, a line I had written the night of the rehearsal. "There is no victory in revenge, only relief in truth. And this is mine." Then a sigh, a click, and the audio stopped. They say when the lights returned, the air felt different, as if something invisible had shifted places. No one spoke. Emily approached the microphone and announced the will had been read in full, that the conditions were irrevocable, and that, from that moment, ownership officially passed to Noel. Some congratulated her, others left without looking back. My children, however, stayed. The eldest, eyes lost, as if seeking an explanation that didn't exist. The middle one, wiping tears with clumsy motions. The youngest, hunched, muttering words no one understood. Noel, in silence, approached the casket and laid a white flower on the wood, saying nothing. When all had gone, Emily closed the hall door and remained there a moment, alone, facing where I lay. Then, they say, she smiled slightly, a small but sincere smile, and murmured, "She did it. And maybe I did. Maybe there wasn't perfect justice nor complete redemption, but at least my voice was recorded, repeating again and again what many wanted to hush. And in that echo, in that persistence that doesn't know death, I found the only possible form of rest. When the last guest left and the murmur of the wake faded down the corridor, the hall was wrapped in that heavy silence you only hear after disaster. They say Emily waited a few minutes before giving the order to close. Noelle stood still, eyes fixed on my portrait above the casket. Outside, night had fallen without a sound, and inside only the echo of voices and the wilted scent of flowers remained. The funeral home's lights flickered, as if they too resisted going out completely. And then, when it seemed there was nothing left to say, the third audio began, the one only Emily and Noelle knew existed. My voice sounded different, closer, almost warm, without the hardness of the previous ones. "If you're still here," I said, "it's because there's one more truth to let loose." That line was enough for those remaining to lift their heads. My children, defeated, were still there, as if their bodies had run out of orders. No one dared move. "Don't be scared," I went on. "There are no accusations or reproaches left. What comes now isn't punishment. It's a condition." On the recording you could hear the soft rustle of paper, as if I were turning pages myself. "I've left a small inheritance for each of you," I continued. "Not as forgiveness, but as memory. But that inheritance has a price, not in money, in truth. You'll only receive it if you sign, together, a document acknowledging my decisions, returning what wasn't yours, and committing not to destroy each other again." A murmur ran through the room. The eldest snorted, incredulous. The middle one lowered her gaze. The youngest clenched his hands on his knees. "If you do," I added, "maybe you'll understand that love isn't measured by control, but by the peace it leaves when you let go." Noelle later said Emily looked at the three, waiting for a reaction. But no one spoke. My voice kept on serene. "If you don't sign, everything goes to the Women's Foundation that helped me not give up when you thought I was already finished. There my name will serve for more than decorating a headstone." Then there was a long silence, and after it the soft sound of a sigh. It was mine. I'd left it in on purpose. And after that sigh came the last part of the message, a line meant only for Noelle. "Open the safe. The code is 1971. Inside there is something that's yours, something you can't buy or steal. Breathe deep when you see it." The audio ended with a click, and the lights flickered one last time before fully returning. Noelle walked slowly to the small office with the safe. Emily followed, keeping the others at a distance. The sound of the lock turning was almost a heartbeat. Inside, they found a thick envelope, sealed with red tape, and on top, a note in my handwriting. For Noelle, who knew how to care for me without promising to. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a letter and a stack of bills folded carefully, just enough to start a new life without depending on anyone. But what made her cry wasn't the money, it was the notebook beneath. The blue-covered one where I'd written my recipes all my life, with notes in the margins, with stains of flour and coffee. On the first page, a message. "This too is inheritance, the only kind that leaves an aroma and not resentment." Noelle closed the notebook against her chest. Emily put a hand on her shoulder and nodded. Neither said a word. Outside, the whispers had ceased. The eldest argued quietly with the middle one, who only nodded with an empty look. The youngest had started crying again, murmuring that he didn't know what to do. No one consoled them. It was their turn to live with the noise of what they'd caused. Emily returned to the center of the hall and spoke with that firmness of hers that never needed shouting. She explained the document had to be signed within 7 days, that the donation to the foundation was ready to execute, and that any attempt to contest the will would be useless. "Your mother was more meticulous than all of us put together," she said, and the phrase fell like a sentence. No one answered. Noelle put the envelope away, shut the safe, and came back to the casket. She leaned in a moment and murmured something no one heard. They say she gave thanks, they say she promised. To use the money for something clean. Perhaps both things were true. When they finally took the body away, the room was empty. The echo of my voice still floated in the air, repeating between the walls the last words of the audio. Don't look for my forgiveness, look for yourselves. That was the line I wanted to close my story with. Not to punish, but to set myself free. The following weeks, I'm told, were a parade of awkward silences, unanswered calls, and furtive visits to the empty house. The eldest tried to negotiate with Emily, but there was nothing to negotiate. The middle one took refuge with a distant relative, repeating it had all been a misunderstanding. The youngest, however, was the only one who signed. He went to the lawyer's office with trembling hands, signed without reading, and left an envelope with the jewels he'd hidden. I want to rest, like her, he said, and walked out without looking back. Noelle moved shortly after. She sold the house, donated part of the money to the foundation, and used the rest to open a small food shop in the neighborhood. On the wall she hung my photo with a white flower and a tiny plaque that read, "The secret is not to let them silence you." People came for the empanadas, but stayed for the story she told between laughs and tears. And so my voice stayed alive, in a different tone, in another kitchen, in other mouths. Of my children, little was heard. They drifted apart, as if guilt were contagious. Sometimes a neighbor claims to have seen them, aged, tired, speaking in low voices. I like to think that now and then, when they hear a light go out all at once, they remember my voice, that voice that called them by name one last time and they couldn't turn off. If I learned anything in that whole process, if death allows learning, it's that you don't say goodbye to the world when you close your eyes, but when others stop listening to what you have to say. And me, at least, they heard. Late, yes, but they heard. And that's why, when the last tape cut and the hall fell silent, there were no laments, no fear, no sorrow. Only the feeling that after all, I'd achieved what I'd sought for so many years without success, for my voice to remain suspended in the air, defying oblivion. And if right now someone hears my story from afar, in another house, in another country, let them know this. Sometimes you have to die to be believed, but there are ways of living worth more than any resurrection. That was my justice, not a punishment, not revenge. Only the certainty that, although my body rests, my voice keeps breathing in the shadows, like the light that goes out and returns, again and again, as if refusing to die completely. And that's how my story ends, or at least the part I could tell you, with this voice that refuses to lie still underground. If you made it this far, thank you for listening, for accompanying me through every silence, every breath I still had pending. Before you go, I'd love to know from where you're listening and what this story left you with. Tell me in the comments, because I still like reading what the living have to say. And if you want to keep hearing voices like mine, those that don't go out even after the end, subscribe. I promise to keep speaking from wherever it is I end up being.